Today on the MrMaple Show podcast, Matt and Brian discuss 20 things you should know before you buy a Japanese maple.
Konnichiwa, y'all, and welcome to another Mr. Maple podcast. Guys, we're MrMaple.com. We have Japanese maples on MrMaple.com and a lot of other great plants, so make sure to check us out on there. We had new plants every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern as well. There's always something fresh coming back to Mr. Maple. Guys, today we're going to give you the top 20 things you need to know before buying a Japanese maple.
Yeah, that's a great topic today, especially for our podcast. I love getting in here and mixing it up with you, Matt, talking about all things plants. I mean, we focus a lot on Japanese maples here, but we do all sorts of plants here at the farm. So a lot of those topics today, we can be talking about Japanese maples and how you can be prepared and set yourself up more for success when you're thinking about buying a Japanese maple. So I'm excited about getting into this.
Oh yeah, we provide daily content on here to help you grow your plants better. So if you're finding us on a podcast platform, make sure to check us out on YouTube as well. We have the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube. And we've got an awesome team together here just creating all kinds of maple-related content. So if that's your cup of tea, hey, come on over and check us out there on the Mr. Maple Show. Again, there's a lot of cultivar breakdowns. That's one of our favorite things to do. Today we're going to give you some interesting tips, little expectations, and what you can expect with collecting Japanese maples. We're going to give you the top 20 things to know before buying one, and it's kind of just a guide to Japanese maples as well. I'm Matt. I got Brian in here with me today, and we're just going to go through some of the awesome stuff about maples. Now, we're going to start at number 1, go all the way up to number 20. At number 1, we've got not all Japanese maples are equally as hardy.
Yeah, very good point here. I think, there's kind of that sudden impulse of like, I'm going to buy a Japanese maple, but it's like, you need to take a second to think about which variety that you're interested in and what zones it's rated for, where you're at in the country. All of those things are very important for your success of, getting that tree and planting it and then having a healthy plant year to year.
We've probably well documented my hatred for the USDA zone system enough on this channel. Maples work zones 5 through 9 essentially, especially on the East Coast. Now that's a good parameter for the East Coast. The West Coast, we have customers in zone 10 in full sun with lace leaf. So there's different mildness to different climates. All of the cold hardiness is rated on all the zones are rated on how cold hardy the zone is. So don't let that throw you off too much. It's basically a good parameter for the coldest condition a tree can take. Now, they recently redid the zones a little bit, and I think it throws us off a little bit more. They kind of rated everything up a little bit, but we still get those outliers. So in Western North Carolina here, we're zone 6B traditionally. They've upgraded us to 7, although we can still get a zone 6 winter. So I always let people know that as well. Different examples of plants in zone 6 would be something like coral bark. So your coral bark Japanese maples, Sangukaku, Benikawa, Little Sango, Bihu. These trees are going to perform better in zone 6 and up. So you don't want those in zone 5. Traditionally, zone 5 can be a little harder for those coral bark types. The Cambium's thinner, so they don't quite winter as well in those heavily zone 5 conditions. Now, if you're right on the 5-6 border, you may be able to get by with it, honestly. Zones are kind of just a suggestion. So you can go to Tony Avent's and walk around that garden and nothing is in zone for where he's at. So zones are a good parameter, but there's always outliers. There's that guy that's on the zone 4-5 belt, where you're really zone 4, sometimes zone 5. So look at your area individually. Now, there's a lot of great maples like Acer pseudosubuldianum that can even push into colder zones. I know some of those going into zone 4. So to learn about the different maples, we've got a big catalog of Mr. Maple, and you can kind of realize what trees are going to do best for your situation. If you're in a colder zone, I would recommend avoiding the coral barks. They're more of a warm, dry zone. They don't want to be wet in the winter months. So taking those conditions into consideration.
Yeah, I think so. Just kind of a synopsis for that would be that. So when you're thinking about buying a Japanese maple at MrMaple.com, there are a way to filter using filters in the search for zones. So that'd be a great way to kind of start. Say you're interested in buying one. Well, let's think about where you're at, what zone you are in the country, and then try to match that zone with the plant as you're searching on MrMaple.com. So, you know, you can kind of think about any of your like coral bark interest maples are typically going to be that zone 6, so it's one zone lower. And then if you go into your like colder zones, you get into Subaldianums, Shirasawanums, Japonicums, get into that zone 4. A little bit hardier of a plant in the cold zone areas.
Yeah, and our cold zones are really rated for roots in the ground. So roots in the soil are a lot different than containers. Typically, containers take you down a zone colder, so just be conscious of that too. I mean, I certainly have coral barks here in Western North Carolina, zone 6 traditionally in containers. We don't heat our greenhouses here. So don't be too afraid of that. Like, you know, don't be afraid to push zones, but be conscious of what you're doing. So typically in the containers, one zone colder than it would be in the ground.
Yeah. And I think, you know, if you find yourself where you're like, man, I'm just continuously having trouble, because zone pushing is kind of fun, honestly. Like I do that with a few plants. I've got some Onsmanthus that I'm kind of pushing some zones on, but I've got them kind of tucked into a protected spot. They're working out well. They're all growing great. They haven't had any damage from the winter yet. But it's something that I'm kind of, you know, pushing that zone on. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your planting. Also, if you are pushing that zone, kind of think about your planting situation too. Do you have it in a protected spot? Is it protected from the wind? Is it up close to the house? Maybe it's getting a little residual hit from the house. Things like that can play a factor into the zone as well.
I certainly push zones here. I mean, we don't even rate Edgeworthia for our area, and I've got 20 plus in the ground. Yeah. So don't be afraid to try new things. I do cite those, like you said, up next to a house or up next to a column, up next to a gate, somewhere where they're getting a little extra protection going on. Just something to kind of keep that heat up a little bit. So you can kind of play with zones there too.
All right, Matt, you think we ought to jump on to the next one here? We got to keep this thing rolling, guys. We could talk about plants forever. But let's go to the next subject here. Number 2, we're going to talk about leaf scorch and how that can affect your Japanese maple.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things going on here. Typically, you know, people think it's a cop-out sometimes. I joke with my buddies. I was, you know, going to a game one time and they're like, what do you think's wrong with this tree? And I was like, well, it's either too wet or too dry. Yeah. And it's like a lot of summer burn will come from, a lot of leaf scorch will occur because the tree's staying too wet because they don't want wet feet, which we harp on a lot. But too dry can look very similar. So that'd be the first thing to identify. But it's not uncommon late summer in that heat to get a little bit of leaf burn on newly planted trees for sure. So if you've got a tree that hadn't been in the ground a long time, hadn't really gotten acclimated to the soil yet, not uncommon to get a little leaf burn in the summer. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially, you know, if you're putting like a 1 gallon or something like that in the ground, you don't have a real established root system yet. So it has a harder time absorbing enough moisture into the plant to keep the leaves looking great.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how you can look at that. When you look at that smaller root ball, you're like, okay, this plant is going to have a hard time keeping the moisture levels right. But also it kind of comes down to what cultivar you pick too for your leaf scorch situation. Some are very heat tolerant plants that can handle full sun and do great. And some are recommended for shade. So if you have a plant that is just getting burned up, well, you might need to look at, you know, what type of variety is this? Is it sun tolerant enough to have it out in full sun, or do you need to find a better spot for it?
Maybe that Acer Shirasawanum needs a little bit shadier spot in the garden.
Yeah.
So consider these factors. Now, the ground can certainly dry out your trees a little bit. I like to plant, you know, we always recommend fall's the easiest time to plant for most folks. Really cold zones, I like planting in the spring because they get those roots acclimated all summer. But so if you're in a really cold zone, sometimes spring's ideal. The honest answer is the sooner you get it in the ground, the better.
Yeah.
I mean, generally, people are like, I'm going to hold this over in my shed and plant them in the spring. Get them in the ground, you know, get them in the ground. Fall's an easy time for planting. I like to kind of push it a little bit. We're going into September soon. I like to plant them a little early and get that summer heat getting the roots in a little bit sometimes too. Yeah. You might drop a little leaf. You've got healthy buds behind there. Don't fret if, you know, you get a little leaf scorch or you start to drop leaf a little bit early when planting early for fall. But, you know, it's part of growing Japanese maples. It's certainly a part we always acknowledge. The ground will dry them out a little bit too. So when you're planting, you know, especially June, July, August time frame, expect the ground to pull moisture out of the trees. Even if we're getting a lot of rain, the ground's going to pull some moisture out of that 1 gallon. Not uncommon to get a little leaf scorch just from that.
Yeah. And I think it's good to kind of like measure your expectation too for certain times of the year. I mean, we're all, familiar with the beautiful spring interest that Japanese maples provide. And even into the summer, some great new growth flushes, great colors. But by the end of that summer, man, some cultivars can look a little beat up, a little rough from that summer. I mean, that's very typical. It's not anything to be overly concerned about. I mean, I've been growing forever, and I'll tell you, there's very few trees that look pristine by the time you get to fall. I mean, it's just part of nature. I mean, even though you don't notice it as much out in the natural environment around you, because those trees are larger.
Your natives are doing the same thing.
Your natives are doing the same thing. It's just a matter of kind of learning how to measure your expectations of certain times of the year what your tree is going to look like.
I had a Japanese nurseryman tell me one time that Japanese maples are for viewing up close in the spring and in the fall and from afar in the summer.
Right, yeah. No, that makes sense. Absolutely.
All right, guys, let's get into another one here. Spring frost can ruin a little bit of that season's show. So we're in Western North Carolina. Depends on where you're at a good bit. Like a lot of our customers further south than us don't experience this like we do. Spring frost can certainly burn a little bit of foliage as well. So be conscious of the spring frost. One of the main things I see, people will plant a new tree and they'll say, what's wrong? Well, you got a spring frost going on. And it can certainly burn up a little bit of foliage. Now, spring freezes are different than spring frost. So spring freezes are more dangerous. You have to protect a lot. I still recommend covering your trees during a frost if you can, if it's at all possible. But frosts tend to make trees not look great for a little bit.
Right.
They do tend to bounce back most. From even our heavy frosts here in Western North Carolina, we'll have those at times. And, by our April open house or even our Memorial Day open house, people won't even notice it in the garden. So it does bounce back from that, but it certainly can take away a little of that spring zip.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people sometimes get a little nervous. They coming out of spring and they're like, man, this thing just looks so rough. What the heck's going on? They think maybe there's some disease going on. You know what I mean? They always think the worst.
Yeah, right.
Right. And it could be something as very basic and simple as there was a light frost one morning and you didn't even notice it. You rushed off to work, and then a couple of days later you start noticing some spots on your leaves and you're like, man, what's going on? And it's sometimes it's hard to really notice those frosts. I mean, there's been times where I was like, man, I don't feel like, we had some risk for frost, but everything looked good. And then a few days later, I noticed on a couple things, I'm like, I guess this did get hit with a little bit of frost. So it's hard to catch it right at first.
And it'll throw you off. One of the most common, kind of denials of this is people will be like, well, I've got trees 20 feet from it and they didn't get affected.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon for a frost to affect one or two trees in the garden more than the others. There's an elevation change. There's more of a shadier spot in the garden where something's casting more shade on it, so it's less protected from the sunlight that kind of prevented some of that frost. So it's not uncommon for one tree to be affected in the garden more than others. So be conscious of that. Again, frost doesn't normally wipe one out. Typically, frost is a kind of a seasonal problem.
Sure.
Freezes you have to be more careful of. I do recommend bed sheets. We talk about what to do during this. I mean, we did a great video, I think, back in the day. It's been a while, probably 3 years ago, but on what to cover your trees with during a frost. I recommend a bed sheet or a frost cloth or something like that. What you don't want to put over them is something that's going to cause more damage. So a lot of times as early springs, especially here in Western North Carolina, we'll go from a frost in the morning to shorts by midday, right? Yeah. So you don't want to put something like garbage bags or plastics, something that can, especially clear plastics, that can really create a lot of extra heat and stress your plant out more than the frost. So be careful there. Frost cloths, bed sheets, things like that, those will give you your best security. I always use this example, but we had this big Makawa type in my yard that Tim wanted to protect, and he went and put a big bucket over it, like a 40-gallon bucket and a heat lamp in there. And we had a cold snap.
Yeah.
Well, by the time we took that off, it was not cold in there. That sauna had baked that foliage pretty good. So I think the tree would have preferred the frost. So be careful that your prevention isn't causing more trouble. Typically, light bed sheets, light cloth fabrics are your best bet. A light tarp, something that's not going to put a lot more heat into the situation, but protect it a little bit from that frost.
Yeah, and I think sometimes in that frost situation too, you kind of almost have to accept, hey, you know what? For the next couple of months, my tree's not going to look as great until it recovers and starts flushing out some new leaves. You may even see a little bit of that frost damage throughout the year because a lot of those leaves may not completely drop. They may hold on if it's just a partial damage on it, and it may kind of have a little rough look throughout the season. And
again, kind of like with the leaf burn we talked about, you tend to get less of this as your trees mature.
Yeah.
Or you notice it less because your trees are up higher. So it is one of those problems that tends to solve itself over time as the tree matures. And you kind of have a bigger canopy there. There might be a little frost at the top of my 20-foot Ueno-yama, but I don't really notice it when it's 20 feet, right? So factor that into your gardening as well. And in the sunnier spots tend to have a little less prevention or a little more prevention towards some of the shadier spots for that. Now, one more warning here I'll throw out. I don't recommend spraying your trees with water during a frost unless you have a commercial sprinkler. Big commercial nurseries will do this, especially down south in Alabama. They'll turn all those sprinkler systems on. They have a commercial well. It's putting out a ton of water for that screen.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, adding water to the equation is more dangerous than not. So I typically recommend don't go out and hose your trees down, things like that. In general, you're going to get more damage with that.
All right, moving on here to number 4. This is, I think, a topic that could be discussed forever. I think it's kind of, there's a lot of debate with it. There's a lot of different perspectives. Sometimes people list this differently, but we're talking about size. We're talking about size at maturity. We're talking about how that, there's this expectation of, people say, how big does this get?
Right.
That's like one of the first questions they say is like, well, in 10 years, we typically say here at Mr. Maple, in 10 years, it will get this size or that size. So you have to be mindful of that when you're talking about sizes, because every cultivar is going to be a little bit different as far as its growth habits and all of those things. And there's so many variables into it. It's hard to give just a blanket number. You really can't.
Right. We look at trees all over the United States because, Tim and I have been shipping trees all over the U.S. for a long time now and really going and observing trees in different locations too. So growth rate will be affected a little bit by your area. If you go down to Nacogdoches, to those gardens at Stephen F. Austin, they've only got about 2 months of dormancy. Their fall is at Christmas and they're leafing back out by February. So their trees do get a little bit bigger, but their growing season is significantly larger than ours. So factor that in to your size at maturity. One thing we always talk about here is that the 10-year expectancy and why we do that. So a lot of places will say, well, what's the max size it gets? And my good friend Peter Gregory, I love Peter Gregory. When he was alive, he was one of my favorite all time. I felt like a kinship with him. He was like an uncle or a grandfather type to me. He was a species guy first. So he would go and study trees in their native ranges. So Peter would go and study, Acer elegantium in the wild. And the biggest one he ever saw was the max range for that tree, which makes a lot of sense with the species growing in its native habitat. For us gardeners, it's kind of a weird dynamic because the biggest one you've ever seen really isn't a good parameter for it. I say a lot of nurseries do this. So they'll kind of put those catch-all size labels on everything, especially your big box stores. So they'll be like, how big does this Tamukiyama get? And you'll go look at it and it'll be like 25 foot by 40 foot wide. You're like, geez Louise. Now the species could get this big in Japan in the ground. The Acer palmatum certainly can get that big, but we're not really going to see that tree be that big in our lifetime. So we try to give a real expectation. Now it's different for, like Tony Avent would be like, well, why do you give a 10-year expectancy? Well, he's dealing with mostly herbaceous plants. They die back each year.
Right.
Maples are going to continue to grow every single year they leaf out. Now, they do slow down a good bit after that 10 to 15-year expectancy as well. So they're not going to be a giant if they're a smaller tree in that 10-year span. So it's a good parameter, but it also gives us a realistic gardening expectation. Most of us are gardening for a 10-year span of how long we expect that to kind of reach that size. I think at maturity can be pretty disingenuous. So we go over that a good bit here too. At maturity is a kind of a vague made-up term.
Right.
So we're trying to speak in real world terms here instead of, well, at maturity, this tree can be, and what you always see is way too small of a size so that people will buy it and not get afraid. Or you see way too big of a size to kind of,
cover
the classic
bases,
is ginkgos. You'll see ginkgos will be like, how big does this get? 40 by 40. Well, not really in anybody's lifetime here. Let's be real. Maybe some ones that Thomas Jefferson planted are that big now, but we're not getting that kind of growth out of this. So we try to give you the best overall understanding of what you should expect growth rate wise. And they are going to slow down a good bit. So those 10-year expectancies, I think, kind of give us our best overall parameter. And I think they're the most fair way to talk about sizes after a time.
Yeah.
We often use Nakakomoto weeping as an example. Like, will you plant this in 400 years? It could look like this for you, right? Well, no one's going to be around in 400 years. That tree's continue to leaf out every year. And it's still growing. It's still putting on a little bit of growth every year when it leaves out. Now, it's slowed down a ton, but it is still growing. A happy grafted Japanese maple, a grafted cultivar, should have a life expectancy of over 100 years.
Yeah. Now, the other side of that, I think, too, that, and I'll just cover this because I think we should talk about it, is there's a lot of factors that will dictate what kind of growth you have, too. As you know, when we go out to Buckholt's nursery out in Oregon and you see some specimens out there and you're like, but it's the perfect growing climate. They have a longer growing season. They have a shorter winter. So it's like, you get more growth out of the certain cultivars in that kind of climate than you would say here, or say like in Oklahoma or something like that. I remember growing in Oklahoma, my growing season was very short. Not very often would I get a summer new growth. All my growth would happen in the spring when it was leafing out, and it would push those new branches, and then it would just kind of go stagnant for summer because it was too hot and too dry. So the plant would just kind of shut down and hold right there, and then we get new growth the next year. Whereas here, like, I'm experiencing a lot more summer growth because we have those milder, cooler, wetter summers. So there's a lot of variances in climate as well. And then cultivar specific is kind of really how you navigate through the size thing. It's like, hey, if I've got a small spot, I need to be looking at a dwarf. Really looking at what sizes it's going to get to, and then if you have a bigger spot, then you can start looking at those larger uprights. But there's so much variability in sizes. I think it's important to kind of understand how that all works.
One of my least favorite terms in maples and in plants in general is at maturity. I'm in my 40s. I'm not sure I've reached maturity yet. I got 3 kids. I don't know if I'm at maturity.
Yeah. How tall are you going to be at maturity, Matt?
So I'm only going out this way now. It's no more up. I have reached my max height, but the width is increasing with age. No, at maturity can be a little disingenuous. And what you see there, again, it's typically people that all the older trees are the biggest because they saw a blood good, an Osakazuki that's been around 30 years. And all the new cultivars tend to be small. And what we're trying to do is give you the best picture. That's why we paint those into more of those 10 to 15 year expectancies. At maturity can be when a tree seeds. Well, some cultivars never seed. It can be conditional for seed. Yeah. What truly means at maturity? Is that the max size it ever gets? And I think that's the assumption most consumers get when they hear that term is, wow, this is the max size. Right. And then it's done.
Yeah, it's never going to grow anymore. Yeah. All right, so we're moving along here, guys. We got a nice list here of topics to discuss. We're going to go on to color changes with climate.
Yeah, this is a big one. So a lot of people will, be really concerned. You'll see in the different maple groups around, this can't be a Tamukiyama because it's a little green right now.
Right. Yeah.
This can't be a blood good. There's no way that's a blood good. Blood goods are red. And you might be talking to somebody in New Jersey in a very mild climate. You might be talking to somebody in Rhode Island. You might be talking to somebody in Dallas. Right? It can be very different conditions. So certainly a lot of our trees will green up a lot more in the summer months. And that's to be expected. Like, that's something you should know going into Japanese maples. The colors are going to change with the seasons. I've had seasons where we had droughts here in western North Carolina, and the entire garden was very green very early. Those trees are in search of chlorophyll. I've had seasons where Twombly's Red Sentinel was green for me in June, July, which is very rare. Right, yeah. It typically is more of a redder plant that holds its color very well. Tamukiyama, again, is one of the very best for holding its red into the season. But those climate changes and those different seasons can affect the color a little bit. So you don't want to rule out. I always tell people the hardest time to identify trees in late summer.
Yeah, for
sure. I'm like, well, let me see some spring color. Let me see some fall color. I'll give you a better guess because things are going to look more similar during those summer months.
Yeah. And you can expect a lot. Like you said, I think the expectation should be that, from season to season, you're going to see some changes happening in that color of the leaf. And if you kind of learn to appreciate how it adapts and changes throughout the season, I think it's not as disappointing. I think some people get that. They're like, man, this celebration's supposed to be pink, and right now it's kind of, and it's like, yeah, man, but like the original leaf out, it had that vibrant spring pink color that you love. And then you get into those summer months, especially if you're in some heat situations, you can see that color fade a little bit before the fall color comes. So
some really cool changes. You start to appreciate too, like even with that one, the summer flushes on that are kind of crazy. You get some hot pinks. And a lot of times some of those secondary colors, we did a whole podcast on our favorite summer colors. You get some secondary flushes that are really nice sometimes on different trees. But we want to give you realistic expectations. So the color is going to change throughout the season a good bit. Nothing stays the exact same color it does in spring all season. And Japanese maples do not. So you're going to get color change going on. There's certainly a lot that hold that color the best. But then you'll have seasons where it completely changes for you too. I mean, The hotter, drier climates tend to green up and get the more chlorophyll in them the quickest. So, keeping them good, well watered in a drought can really change that some too. And some of that's fine because you're going to go into better fall color because the tree was storing energy and not burning up.
Yeah.
All right, guys, moving in here to variegation. So there's a lot of different variegated Japanese maples. There's a lot of different variances there. There's a lot of different styles of variegation. We go into a lot on this channel, so feel free to hop into some of our crazy podcasts on favorite pinks and whites and how to prepare your trees for that. But variegation can change a lot throughout the season too. So certainly you mentioned the celebration, but purple ghost, things like that can fade a little bit in the summer months, especially the Higashiyama styles. Those are some of the most interesting style Japanese maples. They're some of my favorites.
Yeah.
I mean, that group can really just get you entranced with all those color changes of variegation, but they're going to look different in the summer than they are in the spring months.
Yeah. I mean, especially like a lot of times with those varieties specifically, that summer growth doesn't show the variegation as much either. So you're starting to see a little bit of a mix. You're like, man, some of my plants variegated, some of it's not. So it might be something you're concerned about. There's no reason to be concerned about it. Sometimes that new summer growth does not show the variegation like it does the older growth. And then depending on the light exposure and your climate, certain variegated plants may show more variegation in those climates than they would other climates. And then you have variegation that can be very conditional, something like ukigumo, where you might have a year where it's like, wow, this thing just looks perfect. That white variegation is really strong. And then you may come that next season and it leaves out and it's very kind of just maybe little splotchy colors with the little white dusting into it, but mostly green. And you're like, man, what's going on with my variegated plant? I don't understand. There's a lot of seasonal and conditional things that happen with variegation that can change that.
So we often talk about butterfly style variegations. You want to remove any of the all green from those. So if you do have all green reversion in a butterfly style, this will be things like Daddy's Girl, Beni Shishihenga, some of those types like that. You want to remove the all green from stuff. Now it's important to know the difference because things like Higashiyama, they're not going to lose it. So don't cut any of your new growth out of there just because it's greener in the summer. That's going to come back and be perfectly fine. Things like your Ghost series, that reticulate style variegation, it's not going to lose it. So don't be afraid of that. You can certainly kind of plan your plantings and kind of move them around a little bit and figure out what works best for the most drama in your garden. But protecting them from late afternoon sun is a good way to kind of extend your variegation normally longer into those summer months as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great list here, man. I'm glad we were getting into this, the weeds of this, because I think sometimes the expectations, it's hard for people to know, hey, I'm buying this Japanese maple. What do I really need to know? And I think this is a great way to cover some of those topics.
People are like, hey, I want a tree that leaves out red,
right,
and it stays that color all year,
right,
and I'm going to put it in full sun. I'm like, well, what you want to do is go to IKEA and you want a plastic tree because these are living organisms. They're going to change. So really what this podcast is a lot about is different expectations.
Yeah.
But you should know these things before getting into Japanese maples.
So the next topic here we're going to talk about is that not all Japanese maples are slow growing.
Yeah, I mean, people ask me all the time, even friends that start to slowly get into it, and they're like, well, how big do they get? Well, I mean, there's 3 foot, there's 30 foot, right? So you're certainly going to be growing your Seiho a lot differently than you are your Seryu, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there are trees that get out there pretty quick. There's trees that grow over 1.5 foot of growth a year. So we have a whole podcast on the fastest growing ones as well. So if you want to find some fast growing Japanese maples to shade out your garden, we certainly make great suggestions. Seryu, Orange Flame is a great one for fast speed. Stuff like Emperor One, those are trees that'll get out there a little bit faster in your landscape. Now, there's certainly some that are never going to be that size. They're in the same family.
Right.
We don't all look alike in our family. There'll be some smaller ones. There'll be some larger ones. So you can help pick a cultivar that fits for you. Cultivars or Japanese maples are like breeds of dogs, right? I mean, if you're wanting a Chihuahua, you might not want to put a Great Dane in that spot, right?
Yeah.
And so there's definitely some variances there. So it's important to educate yourself about what the cultivars do. And those 10-year expectancy we talked about earlier are really big for this because you can kind of understand better what is going to fit your exact needs for what you're doing in your garden.
Yeah. And I think what's cool about the amount of variety of maples that we have available is that you can find that tree for your spot. There's so many out there. You're going to find that size that you're wanting for that spot. It just takes some time and some research. And I think, when it comes to, different cultivars, let's say you're wanting a lace leaf, but you're like, man, I need it to get big and, fast. well, you might want to go with Germain's gyration.
Heck yeah.
But if you're wanting a green lace leaf that stays small and so you need to know your cultivars and research each one to see which one's going to work best for that spot.
That's one of my all-time favorites. I love Germain's, but I always tell people you have to have the right spot for it.
Right.
Because it's going to be a 10 by 10 in 10 years, which is way bigger than most of our lace leaves. I mean, Waterfall is not going to do that in 25 years, what Germain's is going to do in 10.
Right.
So just be prepared. Look, do the research first, and it's going to make things easier for you. We certainly have that Mr. Maple files category, and you can look up cultivars we've had in the past. Sometimes they disappear they're coming back up soon. So if you don't see them now, they're coming back. But a lot of times we'll have great information on there for you to kind of set your expectations for what the growth rate is on this and help you kind of plan the best tree for that spot. There's some big ones. I mean, there's some awesome big ones that get out there pretty fast. A lot of people are like, oh, those things grow so slow. It does take a second for them to get acclimated, but there's definitely some types that are going to be very large specimens in the landscape in a short amount of time.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, too, the expectation, we have to kind of change that in our mind. I remember when I first started getting into collecting, I was real hesitant to buy a 1 gallon because I was like, man, it's so small and it's going to take so long, But like before I knew it, 3 or 4 years had went by, and I've got a good looking tree. You know what I'm saying? Like, so in your mind, you kind of tell yourself, it's going to take so long. They grow so slow, but time flies. We all know that, right? Time is flying. And before you know it, that little 1 gallon that you buy, it's going to be a beautiful tree in your garden. And I think it's good to kind of reset that expectation in your mind and kind of get a new idea of how these things are going to grow. Not all Japanese maples are slow growing.
We mentioned containers too. Containers will certainly slow them down. I mean, we have 35-year-old trees at Buckholtz in containers. So 50-year-old trees in containers at Buckholtz. So certainly containers are going to keep them a little smaller than they would in the ground. So factor that into your consideration also. So if you're going to leave it in a pot for a while, it may be a little bit smaller than if you just got that Cereus or that big guy in the soil. It's going to be a lot faster growing. So they do take off. Like there is a stage where you're getting a lot of growth and you're surprised by how much they're growing. So factor that into your gardening as well.
All right, let's dive into kind of the root system behind Japanese maples and kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Japanese maples don't want to be planted too deep. That's one of the main things. The roots do like that air, so they like that airflow. You don't want to bury plants too deep. We talk a lot about the volcano of death. They're still teaching at some colleges because you see it everywhere. Yeah. Some landscaper out there is like, this is how you do it. You want to pile up about 8 foot of mulch around the tree. Yeah. Not for Japanese maples. So maybe in some really cold climates they're trying to insulate something, but not for Japanese maples. They need that airflow. You're going to have a better growth rate if the roots are slightly exposed, not buried too deeply, not compacted soils, good drainage, and they're going to have that kind of just more natural airflow setting to the tree. You don't want your tree planted too deep. It's the easiest way to stunt one back, especially a grafted tree. I've had nurserymen tell me, oh, well, I'll just bury that graft so you don't see the graft. Grafts disappear in a few years for the most part.
Yeah.
Grafts, people are like, it's a bad graft. Well, like grafts, a good graft's one that took, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to be seeing through your graft, but if it's a healthy graft, it's a healthy graft. You don't want to bury that. They're going to disappear and clean up very well once the old wood starts to grow over that. What you don't want to do is bury that graft, because what will happen is you'll start to re-root above that. It'll really slow the growth rate of your tree down and really hurt the overall health if you're burying it too deeply. You want to be conscious of that when you're adding mulch to your garden, not to put too much mulch around the Japanese maple base, because you don't want to bury that graft, because over time it's going to slow the growth rate down a good bit. It can even cause diseases or bacterial infections, cause a lot of issues for your tree. So you want that base to kind of be where you want it, slightly raised, not too deep. At the same time, I think too much can be made a root flare. I'll get controversial here. People joke with me all the time and they'll send me pictures and they'll be like, there's no root flare. Well, there's not going to be a lot of root flare on a 1 gallon because they don't have huge buttress roots yet. Right. As they establish themselves, they're going to get more of that. Watering exposes a lot of roots. So if you're watering, with a wand or anything like that, you're going to start to expose roots over time. But don't be so scared that you have to expose every root. The Japanese aren't going out in the native landscape in Japan and scraping out all the root flare on every tree in the forest. Yeah. I've seen 60-foot Acer palmatums that are several hundred years old in the wild, and nobody went out there and cleared the roots away every year. Yeah. Don't worry about it that much, but you don't want it planted too deeply. They do need to be a shallow planting that's not planted super deep underground. If you're compacting that soil around the base, that's going to cause issues for the health. Yeah,
I think another big issue we had a discussion out in the field the other day about this, was planting a ball and burlap. A lot of people just say, "I'll just leave it in the ball and burlap and just put it in the ground." And it's like, look, there's too many scenarios in which that's not going to work out. One, a lot of times you don't know how deeply that is planted in the original soil that it's bagged up in. The other part is what kind of soil is in that. The other part is a lot of times they wrap that sack around the trunk and they tie it. So it's just sitting there girdling on that trunk. And then they put a wire cage around that as well. So like, you don't want to plant something with all of those things. You're not going to be set up for success with
Brian's like, I see your root flare controversy, and I'm taking it up a notch.
Yeah.
The landscapers have the pitchforks at the gate right now.
I know,
it's
right?
a controversial topic. People hate hearing this, but you don't want to leave the burlap around your tree. It will slow it down.
Yeah.
A lot of these industrial burlaps don't break down like they used to either. Like I've had people plant trees. I've moved them later. I've seen burlap that was 30 years old in the ground around one, and it certainly can create a container that keeps them in there too long. Those wire cages stay there. They can break down, but they're still going to restrict roots. They're going to change the root growth. An ideal situation. It's not ideal for a lot of landscapers because you got to actually get it out of the ball.
Right.
It's a lot harder to get in the ground, a big old heavy tree. But you don't want that. You don't want that burlap staying on there long term, and you don't want that wire cage staying around them.
So I guess this kind of ties into this next little topic here, talking about wet feet with Japanese maples. Those root systems do not like to be continuously exposed to standing water. So if you have a spot in your garden where it's just always holding water after rain or things like that, not a good spot for Japanese maples.
They don't want wet feet. I mean, I don't either. I don't want to be sitting here with wet feet while I'm doing the pod. They don't want to be sitting there with wet feet all winter. Winter wet feet is the most dangerous because it causes more bacterial infections. It can cause a lot of that black fungus forming in the tree. We often talk about Pseudomonas, but Pseudomonas is a thing that forms in the soil. A lot of damages will look like that, though. So wet feet can lead to more issues like that. Continually keeping your tree too damp, it's just a no-go for Japanese maples. You need to be conscious of that. Water can change in your house too. So sometimes someone will say, I've had this tree here for 5 or 6 years. I don't know what's wrong. Well, I did redo this other bed. Now all the water flows coming here.
Right.
And you've created a situation where the water cycles change a little bit in your yard. And now that area is staying too damp. So be really conscious of that. And not planting too deep helps. Planting slightly elevated kind of gives you a little bit more wiggle room for if things do kind of adapt and change over time. But they don't want to be with wet feet at all. So think of other plants like bald cypress, even dawn redwoods, katsura trees. Those can actually help dry up an area. I mean, you don't want to give them too much root competition, but katsura trees are great to dry up an area. So you can plant stuff like that. Not the katsura Japanese maple, but the katsura tree. Those are great for drying up spots that could be a little bit more damp. And they may be a better choice for a Japanese maple if you know that spot is pretty soggy generally. If it's a spot that's really soggy, I've seen Japanese maples planted in creek beds, Now they will grow along creeks and rivers in Japan, but they're up where it's dry. So they're hanging out over that creek bed. Don't let that fool you. You get those roots down that water, it's over. They do not like that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely something to consider when you're thinking about, location of what you're going to plant in a certain spot in your yard. I think it's like I said, I think this is all about just topics of like information that you should consider when you're looking at buying a Japanese maple. Where are you going to plant it? What's your climate? We've been covering a lot of these topics. They all kind of tie together. This is something you need to be thinking about before you click the buy button, because we want you to be successful. We want you to send us that picture and be like, man, this thing's doing great.
Right.
It looks so great in my garden. Thanks so much. But if if you're not looking at these things, you might find yourself struggling. You're like, man, what's going on with my tree? I don't know what, this thing's, I don't have a green thumb. I hear people say that all the time. I don't have a green thumb. It's like, well, maybe though, if you've done some research, you might be a little more successful in your planting.
So we're all the way up to number 10 here. Now we covered a little bit about mulching, but this one is about mulch to help regulate temperatures. So if you're in a hotter climate, Memphis, Dallas, even Alabama, a lot of our southern growers, mulch is great to help kind of keep that temperature down on the plants. Fresh mulch can certainly cool it off. You got to be careful with the mulch isn't too hot when you're putting it out, but a good coating of mulch each year is great. Now I mentioned you don't want to bury your tree down with that mulch, so you want to be conscious of that too. But adding some mulch around an older tree, those roots are going to spread out. You don't want to cover that crown of the tree, the initial base right beside it, that 1 to 2 foot on a small tree. Around that tree, you want to be careful with the thickness of mulch there.
Yeah.
But certainly a little bit of mulch over top of those roots can cool those roots down a hotter summer.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important, especially in those hotter climates, because you're going to regulate kind of the moisture in the soil as well. It's going to kind of create a barrier from the sun and your soil, so it's not going to heat up that soil too quickly and dry out too quickly. It's going to help kind of maintain that moisture level there. And then your winter months too, if you're in a spot where you get a lot of hard freezes in the winter, it's going to help kind of insulate that ground around the roots of your tree, which I think is very beneficial. There's a lot of great benefits from mulching.
Joe Gardner goes into it in depth. I mean, trees that have a good mulch base, it can change your whole soil dynamic. I mean, it really conditions the soil. Light pine barks, especially here in the South, is what's available. Depends on where you're at, but light barks really condition that soil. And you can change, red clay topsoil into pretty good soil in a few years with mulch. That mulch base really changes the whole component, and it really makes more of a landscape garden environment for the trees. So you're getting more of that natural wooded environment, which is great. Now, I also throw into this category small other plants. My mom does a great job with this. So she plants a lot of sedums, a lot of low growing plants that don't have invasive root systems around her maples. And they provide a lot of those similar characteristics to the mulch. So you're getting that cooling effect in the spring and summer, and it's really helping the tree regulate the temperature, especially if it's in a high sunny condition. Sedums are great for that. So small, low-growing sedums, they really can look ornamental around a plant too. You can kind of play with the color. Something like Angelina can give you a nice yellow around your Japanese maple. And you can use those closer to the base as long as they're not big root systems. You want to be very cautious of trees with large root systems. You don't want to put, a giant hosta right beside your Japanese maple because it's going to give it some root competition. But maybe some dwarf hostas relatively close can help. So you got to be conscious of what you're putting around it. You don't want to drown out that root system with a fast-growing plant. Japanese yews, oh my gosh, they have huge root systems. Yeah. So be careful of those right next to your maples. But some small, low-growing sedums and things like that, they can accentuate what you're doing with the mulch. They can decrease your amount of mulching you have to do, and they provide that same cooling characteristic that the mulch does.
All right, guys, moving on to the next topic here. Matt, let's dive into pruning. We need to kind of, hit this topic about pruning. I think people always have a lot of questions about that. They're always calling our office, when's the best time to prune, things like that. So I think it's an important topic to discuss. So
one thing we'll get out right up front, you can prune out dead or crunchy growth at any time. That's probably something people ask all the time. If it's already damaged bark, and it's not uncommon to get a little dieback in the winter, especially in some colder places, you get a little branch on a large tree or something like that. Trees are adjusting. They're going to continue to grow. You may have some lower branches that get less sun that eventually die out of the tree. That's perfectly natural in every habitat, especially in the native landscape with native plants. So be conscious of that. You can take out any crunchy or dried bark pretty much any time of the year. Now, I like to do my pruning in early spring. So I go right before the trees leaf out. I'll start here in February. I'll go up to mid to late March because normally by the end of March we're in leaf here. I think for any major pruning, right before the tree leaves out is your most rejuvenative time. Yeah. Now, this can be controversial. People will recommend different times. If you're doing bonsai, people reduce size of their trees by pruning in late summer once that grow's hardened off. And you certainly can make adjustments. A lot of people recommend pruning in fall. I actually don't. I don't recommend pruning your Japanese maples in fall. The healing time is so much longer. It's the worst time for the tree's rejuvenative stage, right? The tree's shutting down. It's going into winter. Insects are looking for places to go. You're opening the tree up with a wound. I like early spring because that's when we graft, because the heal time is so much quicker. You can get a much quicker callus over to your pruning. We've got a lot of videos here on how to prune. I mean, we've got one we shot a couple years ago. It's probably on the MrMaple Show YouTube. I think it's 180,000 views now. So go check that out. We've done versions on lace leaves, on uprights, a lot of different tips for how to prune them aesthetically. And we like to go to different pruners and kind of talk about what you do. Early spring will be your most forgiving. We did a great one with Elton where we went and talked about pruning coral barks. Now, we do that typically in early spring because that healing's so much more important for a coral bark during that time. So you don't want to be pruning that going into winter, opening it up to disease, opening it up to bacteria, slowing down the tree. Now, if you're taking away major branches, early spring is the best time to do it. If you are doing a small reduction in size, don't be afraid to do a little of that in summer once it hardens off. That's something you can do. Typically, pruning in late summer reduces the size of your tree more. And it shocks people to say this, but pruning early spring actually makes your tree grow a lot faster.
Right. Yeah, you're kind of activating the tree. It's going to put it into active growth mode there in that early spring. And I think it depends on kind of the cultivar as well as of when to prune, depending on what type of pruning you're doing. Like you said, if you're reducing size or if you're trying to increase variegation. Like we've got a video on how to prune a tree to increase variegation. So there's a lot of reasons to prune. And I think it's important to know, the best times for each style of pruning or what you're pruning for and how to accomplish it at the best time of the year.
Yeah, and really look at what you're doing it for. I think that's such an important point. Some people will be pruning their tree every year and they're wanting to get bigger there. And I'm like, well, you need to be doing it in early spring or not at all. So don't be reducing your size of your tree in fall if you're wanting your tree to get larger. You're taking energy away from the plant at its time where it's slowing down. But yeah, be conscious of what your overall goal is for that tree. If you've got a 1 gallon a Crimson Queen you put in a container, you let that thing grow for a while before, if it's in a planter,
right,
it might not need to be pruned at all.
Right.
So let that tree kind of get its own natural vibe. Let it fill out a little bit. Let it fill out some of its own natural characteristic before you start to kind of shape them. Here at Mr. Maple, we typically don't shape trees until they're in 7 or 10 gallons. We'll start to make more adjustments there. We'll cosmetically shape a branch or two on a younger plant, but we want the tree to kind of get its own natural characteristic to it before we kind of embark on everything we want that tree to look like.
Yeah. All right, what do we got next, Matt?
We got summer sun exposures and how it matters. So, summer sun exposures can vary all over the United States. So we talked about this a little bit, but you need to be careful in your hottest zones to be protecting them from late day sun. Typically, your zone 9 East Coast, you can grow maples, but they're going to need a lot more shade in a zone 9, sometimes even in a zone 8, depending on what cultivar you're looking at. Now, there's certainly, we've been developing heat seekers and more heat tolerant plants all the time. That's something we work on here a ton at Mr. Maple. We're always looking at Acer Oliviernum because it can push sunlight zones. But you want to be careful with putting, something like a Larian in a full sun exposure that might look great in the early spring. Come August, that might not be the best exposure for that tree.
Yeah, definitely. I think when it comes to the summer months as well, you got to think about, which cultivar you're putting out into the more sun locations, because it's going to depend on how great it looks. Now, I will say, like you said, summer's different in different parts of the country. Summer in Oklahoma and Memphis, Sean knows this. It's hot, man. Very few plants do well in full sun in Oklahoma. Let me say it. So you have to be mindful of that. And I think, with most in general, we kind of have a blanket statement with Japanese maples is most Japanese maples prefer morning sun, afternoon shade. And that's a pretty good,
I'm still looking for that garden that's all morning sun.
It's a pretty good template. But, we all know that our gardens don't always work out that way. The way our shade is in our garden is typically not the ideal situation. So we have to work around that and figure out ways to plant out into the sun. But if we pick the right cultivars, I think we'll be fine. Yeah,
and you can also plan your garden so that your more temperamental sun plants do get that early morning sun, late day shade. So certainly, consider not putting your Ryusin in the early morning sun, late day shade. That one might be one you push more into the sunlight, where something like Snow Kitten or even a variegated type that you want to have more dynamic color late, you're giving that early morning sun, late day shade dynamic. Maybe your Amber Ghost, which tends to be very heat tolerant for me as well, but you're going to get more color on that by giving it more of a protected evening sun situation. So kind of plan your focal point plants and your plants you want to look the best. Kind of give them that optimal early morning sun, late day shade. That's going to be where your more, showier variegation plants kind of take up that room in our garden. Things like Makawa, Tsubusa, things like Ryusin, things like Emperor One, those may be plants we venture more out into that full sun setting, and they're fine. So
yeah. All right. So moving on here, we're going to get into pests. We all deal with this. Very common problem. All across, especially get into the summers, and the insects start getting pretty active and you start having all these different issues, leaf spots. There's so many things that can play into this because there's so many different pests that can stress your trees out. But one of the things I think we talk about this a lot is most of the time the insects are going to target trees that are stressed to begin with. So if you have a tree that's in a situation that is stressed, maybe it's overheated or too dry or whatever it is, if that tree is stressed, it's more likely to be attracted.
They're actually going to give off pheromones that attract the Japanese beetles and other plants to them because they're already more stressed material the insects are looking for. Right. Again, why I don't like to prune in the winter a little bit, because it does open them up to that attraction to those insects. I read that in my brain as pets can be a problem. I was thinking about somebody's dog eating their tree. My brain immediately went to somebody's dog peeing on their plant. I'm like, that does happen. So be careful with your big dogs. Not normally a problem. But with pests, the first step for pests really is something we talked about before, which is the not too deep and the good drainage. So that's the first step in pest prevention. Most of our insects on Japanese maples don't kill the tree. Yeah. Boring insects in some of the hotter zones, we don't get that here. But some of the much hotter zones, boring insects can be a problem. You want to reach out to your local ag extension agent, see exactly what's going on there and how to treat. There's a whole litany of ideas from, copper fungicides and different treatments for that. Boring insects are the one insect that does tend to kill a plant and cause more issues. So be conscious of that. That's normally in hotter zones. Like here in Western North Carolina, we get -9 at times. So we tend to wipe out those kind of insects. Most of our insects that we deal with are like leaf hoppers that can cause little fungal spots, things that kind of conditionally make the tree look a little less for that season, but they don't tend to destroy the tree overall. So be conscious of that, because some of the preventions can be worse than the leaf spot. So
Right.
you don't want to go out there. Light insecticidal soaps are your jam there. I mean, a lot of times you can wipe out leaf hoppers or light little fungus spreaders with a light insecticidal soap. I do recommend just buying insecticidal soap. It's the most safe.
Yeah.
You can create your own soaps. You want to be careful that any of the soaps you put out on insects aren't antibacterial. Antibacterial will affect the tree as well. So we got to be really conscious of what we're doing. I've seen a lot of bad information out there on people using soaps that were, antibacterial, and then that really affected the growth of the plant.
Yeah, you have to be careful when you're treating for pests, because for one, like, and I'm kind of a very natural approach with a lot of that stuff. I mean, I like to have a balance in my garden, and I don't like to use a lot of nasty chemicals and things like that. I think a lot of times we do worse for your environment by doing those things than just allowing some minor pests. I mean, we got to realize that we're gardening in this great big world, right? I mean,
Nothing's eating your plants; they're not part of the environment,
right? I mean, everybody's like, "How do I get rid of these ants?" And I'm like, "That's not going to happen. They're going to be there forever. They've been here way before you, and they'll be here when you're gone. So, like, you're not going to get rid of a lot of the pests. You just have to learn how to kind of balance and kind of treat accordingly. If you see something really starting to get infected, you might need to, get into some treating, like some scale or something like that, if you really start to see a lot of scale happening. But a lot of those treatments too can just be water, just straight water. Like you can just brush them off, spray down the tree, and kind of use your hand to just kind of rake off some of those scale, things like that. Can be easily treated. You don't have to break out all these nasty chemicals to treat a lot of that stuff. I think, it's really important that we kind of keep that in mind when it comes to pests.
Check your plants frequently too. One of the main things is you've ignored it for a while, and now you have a huge problem.
Right. Yeah.
And that seems to be where we find the most issues. It's like, well, now I have this huge issue. I hadn't been checking this plant. Check on your nice Japanese maples frequently. You can kind of get into it early. Scale, typically we see crepe myrtle scale on Japanese maples a little bit. Those are things you want to treat out of leaf with a systemic. So you don't want to use those in leaf. It certainly can affect the leaf shape and everything during the spring. Be careful about that. Insecticidal soaps are your friend, but you want to identify the bugs. So sometimes you just have to go to the ag agent.
Right.
It differs per area. So like we've got great people here at kind of determining it. Everybody loves to get the microscope out. I think Jordan at Buckholz is one of the best at identifying bugs too. He can identify the bug and the insect with the best of them. And we want to be careful, though, that we're not over-treating the issue, causing more stress on the plant for the issue. It's all a kind of a balance, like you were saying. It's a trade-off. Like there's going to be some insect interaction with your plants.
Yeah.
They're in the landscape. They're not in a biodome.
Right.
That's, we're not creating that in our landscape. So there's going to be some trade-off there. And you need to be paying attention to them closely so that you can kind of mitigate these things when they start. Oftentimes when we see those leaf spots late summer from that fungus, it's from leaf hoppers that were there in the spring. Again, I don't treat that much for it because typically it doesn't hurt the plant overall. And it depends on how big the outbreak is of the issue.
Right. All right, guys, moving on to the next topic here. We're going to start talking about grafts and graft unions and just kind of understanding and setting the expectation on that. We get some emails occasionally of people like, "Oh, is this graft okay? Maybe this is a bad graft." I don't think people really understand the depth of grafting and how it can look kind of a little rugged at first. I mean, it is kind of you literally cut into a plant and bound in another branch. So it's a little rugged at first. It looks a little off.
On 1 gallons, you're definitely going to see that graft union. We talk a lot about why we graft. We have videos on here how to graft. We have a whole playlist on our YouTube channel about how to graft. So if you want to learn that, we actually spell it out in great detail for you. Great resources for us. I wish those resources were there when we started to kind of learn some of these things. So we give you a lot of insider tricks to grafting as well. A lot can be made about grafts. I hear people that say, I want a real one, I don't want a grafted one. And it's like, well, then just grow some seed. That's fine too. They can make great plants. But if you want cultivars that are named, you're going to need a grafted plant.
Yeah.
And so know what you're getting into with a graft. There's going to be a little grafting in there on smaller plants. They do tend to heal over in time. They're not necessarily a weak place. You don't want to be seeing through a graft. So you don't want your graft to be something that's hanging on by a thread by any means. But once that graft's healed over and you have a good take, typically it's going to be a good, strong part in the plant. Grafts are far more preferable for the landscape than rooted cuttings. So grafts are the way to go for Japanese maples. They tend to be the trees that have that 100-year life expectancy. When we talk about the 1700s Japanese maple list, they've been grafting them in Japan that long for a reason.
Yeah.
And so people tell me, I don't want to graft at all. I was like, well, you should go look at Japanese maples in Belgium. You should go look at Japanese maples in the UK. You should go look at Japanese maples in New Zealand. There's a reason why it's the accepted way all over the world, because it is the best way to get a healthy root system on a new cultivar.
Yeah.
Some things like lace leaves would be very weak on their own roots. So when we pick a new lace leaf cultivar, we try to get it grafted right away because it's going to be so much more durable and healthy. And a graft is by far the most preferable way to do it.
Yeah, and I think when it's a young 1 gallon plant too, I think sometimes our focus can be on that grafted area. You're like, man, I hope this thing looks right. But I mean, I've seen a lot of, pretty mature maples, and I've never been at a mature maple and going like, man, that graft on that thing just don't look right. You know what I'm saying? Like, so at some point that, that tree is going to, that graft union is going to kind of dissolve into what is the whole tree. You're not going to notice it as much when it's a young plant. It's definitely kind of one of those things, especially if you're new to it, you're kind of like, man, I don't know, is this right? But if you kind of know what the expectation is early on, I think you're going to feel better about when you see that graft. You're going to be like, okay, in a couple of years, this thing's going to look fine. Now,
we do have a video explaining this to high grafts versus low grafts. You'll see a lot of lace leaves that are grafted on a little bit of a standard. Very common in conifers as well to be on standards. Standards can be awesome in your garden if you like them, but know what you're getting into. Standards are typically 14, 18 inches up on Japanese maples, and it just gives that straight stalk look for a little bit. Honestly, it doesn't change too much long term. If you go into older gardens, you don't really notice what the high grafts are after time.
Right.
They just look like beautiful trees and landscape. A lot of times when we're starting to garden out, a high graft could give you a little bit of raised elevation for your other plants around it. So that's one of the main benefits, or that a high graft, you can put more of those sedums, you can put more of those hostas and things and kind of have that elevated bed, bring it up a little bit higher. It doesn't affect the tree too much long term. Long term, the heights aren't going to be much different really with a high graft versus a low graft, unless it's an extreme high graft.
Right.
Unless you're grafting. I mean, we have some buckholts that are grafted on 20-year-old plants already. So we've grafted lace leaves, like that big red filigree was grafted to a tree that already had a huge base to it. So we've certainly created a much larger red filigree by doing that. But for the most part, when you're talking about a 1 or a 3 gallon size plant and it's grafted at a moderate height, you're not really affecting the size of it too much. But know what your preference is for a high graft or a low graft. And that can kind of elevate the garden. We've been doing more lollipops on macaws and things like that. And they're kind of fun because they just create a bigger presence in the garden right away.
Yeah, and I think it kind of ties into our next topic here, which is air circulation and how important that is. A lot of times, the decision to do a high graft on something can be for circulation reasons. We've talked about this with snow kitten. Talon Buckholz always preferred to do a high graft snow kitten because of the circulation. He felt like that the air movement kind of kept some of those fungal issues from getting into the plant. And also kind of a more vigorous rootstock as well kind of helps support a weaker plant like that.
Shout out to Talon. He's, I guess in retirement, he's got a second wind because he's back at the nursery pretty much every day right now. Man, so he's been cutting rootstocks. He's been cutting signwood. The parts of the job he loves, he's still there doing. So his retirement hadn't, I look at his hours. He's getting a lot of hours. Yeah. And he's one of those guys, he's like, if you're paying me hourly, you're getting your money's worth. He kicks some butt out there. So Talon's still heavily involved in our production and quality process out there at Buckholz, which is just awesome. But he does love some standards to increase that airflow. And sometimes with some of those dwarfs, it certainly can help. Be conscious of the area you're putting your tree in. Sometimes covered porches can be a great place for a plant, but you might need to rotate them out. If you've got an area that's kind of stagnant airflow, even up next to houses, sometimes you'll start to see a little bit more of that mildewy look to them. And sometimes that's just the airflow. Like the tree actually needs some natural light, some natural airflow. Really stagnant areas can definitely create more ugly growth on your plant. So be conscious of that. Move the plants around if they're in containers. put them in spots where they're going to get decent airflow. Most of our gardens are going to be fine for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most situations are going to be ideal. I mean, airflow, I think, just as important as, for the plant to dry out. You don't want the plant to stay too wet. We talked about that with the roots and things like that. But I think just air movement in general on those leaves, I think those good for those leaves to dry out. If they stay too wet for too long and there's no air movement there, you can start getting powdery mildew, things like that start to set in. So you have to be mindful of that when it comes to air movement.
One more thing to be conscious of there on the air movement, be careful playing too close to your air conditioners. Those can throw a lot of hot air out, can dry out a plant, can make them crispy. Might not be running in the spring as much when you plant that tree, but right. when August comes around and that air conditioner's pumping out hot air right on that tree to cool your house, it can be quite shocking. So be conscious of what the kind of the air environment. Japanese maples are pretty wind resistant. I've never really seen wind be too much of a problem for maples. Now, people in the Midwest can certainly have more wind than us,
right?
But wind's normally not the main issue with maples. You want to make sure they have adequate airflow. That's why we don't grow them indoors. They don't like that. They're going to get real stagnant inside.
Yeah. And I think even with like you said, with the wind, I mean, typically, in that situation, if you're keeping them well watered, typically that wind is not going to be an issue. The wind can dry out the foliage, can dry out the ground really quickly. So you might see a plant get a little bit of shock from some wind, but typically it's not from the wind. It's from lack of moisture, typically.
All right, we're all the way up to number 16. We're going to talk about Japanese maples in containers. Now, this is a hot ticket item. It's a topic we talk about a lot here on our channel. Japanese maples certainly can be grown in containers. I think sometimes containers can be too much of a crutch. I'll go ahead and say that up front. Sometimes people will go, well, that's got to be a container plant. Generally, I find everything's easier to grow in the ground than it is in container.
Right.
That goes for snow kitten even. I've got a snow kitten that's been in the ground 10 years. People are like, I'm afraid to plant it. Well, if you find the right condition, the soil's normally more forgiving than a container, because in the container, we have to be the main support system for all aspects of that tree. It can't naturally regulate its temperature. It can't sometimes naturally get water. You want to be careful if your container's in a porch or somewhere it's not getting natural water to it. Containers dry out faster. Certainly maples are an ideal plant for containers though, but you have to be more cautious that you control every bit of that environment a little bit more. Containers are going to take a little bit more attention to detail than the ground. Yeah,
definitely a little bit more maintenance involved with that. You have to choose what type of soil. You have to think about feeding the plant too. Over time, it can just become all roots and very little soil or nutrients there.
That's
for
the main
plant.
thing I see.
You get a root bound plant is something you definitely don't want. You have to provide that fresh soil and nutrients for the root system. So there's a lot more maintenance to it, and it can be challenging, but I think it allows for people to garden in areas where maybe they don't have the ability to plant right now. I can't put anything in the ground. I know me and Sean's talked about that. Where you're in a situation, it's like, man, I'm not going to be here for a long term, so I'm going to grow things in containers for a while until I get to my new place. Which it's great for that. I mean, it's perfect for that kind of situation. Most maples are going to acclimate to that very well. They do great in containers.
So be conscious of those things when container gardening. All containers aren't equal. They got to have a good drain hole in them. You got to really focus on the drainage in containers. Check your containers at least every 3 to 4 years. Like at least every 3 years. I recommend in February going out there, pulling it out of the pot, kind of assessing the root growth. They're at their most forgiving again then. So you can kind of take the tree out. You don't want to bare root maples for the most part, but if a little more soil's coming off during February, it's easier for it to regulate. You don't have a lot of microfibrous roots you're disturbing. So I like to go out in February and check my trees and pots, kind of pull them out of the pot. How much root growth do I have? Am I going to have enough space in this container for the root growth for this season? You'll see a lot of times, I would say one of the main times people have issues container gardening, they've had a nice lace leaf or something in a pot for a while, and they haven't been checking that root growth like I'm talking about in February. And then they'll go away in July or August, and the tree's done fine the last 4 years, right? It's looked great.
Right.
But it didn't get watered for a week, which was not a problem the year before. But now that root ball's filled up most of that container, so it's drying out so much quicker. And it doesn't take much of a heat spike or lack of water to send that tree into a little bit more shock, dropping leaves. Now, Japanese maple's first line of defense typically is to get naked. They drop their clothes, right?
Yeah.
So they'll drop all the foliage when you get one stressed. It honestly is great because one of the things that you can't do with conifers, once they drop their leaves, it's pretty much over. Maples will re-leaf on you, especially late in the season when you have healthy buds. But to avoid that, check them in February. Every so many years, just kind of take it out of the pot, assess how much root growth you have in there, And you either want to pot that tree up or lightly root prune the roots back in February. You can root prune them and then put them back in the same size container. This will kind of bonsai the tree down to a smaller container. You can keep a big tree in a pot a long time and keep it smaller by doing that. Or you can go ahead and move it up to the next size pot. So it might be time, you're wanting to get this one on the ground eventually. It might be time to look at a bigger container for that tree if you don't want to cut those roots back and let it kind of fill out a little bit larger the next setting. I think optimally all trees after a certain amount of time kind of find their way to the ground. So, after a certain amount of time, you've enjoyed it in the pot. It's nice to get it in a more permanent spot, let it do its own thing. But it'll surprise you. That root ball will get big in there. And then 1 year, it hadn't done it the last 4 years.
Right.
But now there's not enough, there's a lot of soil missing because all those roots have expanded. And now it's drying out way quicker. It's getting stressed way faster. Don't put the saucer of death under them. Make sure you got good drainage in your container. But they're easy to grow in pots.
All right, moving on to the next one here. We've got fall planting or spring planting. Which one are we doing here? What do you recommend, Matt?
So there's a little different lines of thought on this. I like fall planting because it's the most forgiving. I'm in Western North Carolina, so I know I'm in a very mild climate. We get cool nights here, even in our hotter time of the year. I like going a little bit before fall sometimes here just to kind of get the root growth in. Fall planting is most forgiving. So in general, 99%, well, I say 9, a lot of our customers are going to do better with fall planting. The trees get acclimated all winter.
Yeah.
They start to take up energy more efficiently. The roots get set in. The air pockets get out of that root ball. Everything's kind of ready for spring, right? And they're going to be insulated. They're going to be growing better if they're in the ground. It kills me sometimes. I'll hear people say, I'm going to hold them in containers and then plant them next spring. I'm like, just put it in the ground. You're going to be so much easier. You're going to cause yourself so much less stress getting in the ground. The sooner you get the tree in the ground, typically the better off you are. I end up planting here in all the wrong seasons. I mean, we're sticking trees in the ground here in July every year, big trees. It's when we have time to plant. So, I mean, you plant when you have time to plant. Now, I have heard some interesting things about a lot of colder zones. A lot of our people who are in those borderline zone 5s like to plant in spring. And I do think there is a benefit to that in some of the colder zones. So if you're in a really cold zone, sometimes that spring planting after the frost, kind of after all that craziness is slowed down from your winter, gives you a longer season to get that tree established before the cold of the winter. So I do see some benefit to spring planting. Spring's when we plant most of our trees. And for most folks that are gardening Japanese maples, they're pretty durable. Like we kind of over worry about these things. And you can plant spring, summer, fall, winter. Anytime the ground's not frozen is okay to plant a Japanese maple. Right. But you're going to have your best success and easiest to least amount of transpiration, least amount of stress in the fall is generally the rule of thumb. We plant most of our trees in the spring because that's when we're excited about them. So we got that new tree we're going to get in the ground. Don't worry about overholding trees in pots. That's the main thing I would tell to people. People will leave a collection of 1 gallons, in a shady spot that's not really taken care of, and they kind of forget about them. And I think if they went ahead and put their trees in their preferred spots, in May, they would have looked a lot better come fall anyway.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easy to kind of overthink that whole situation. I mean, I've been growing and planting for a long time, and most typically, if I'm getting a new plant, it's going in the ground. It really not depending. It doesn't really matter what time of the year. My plan is to put it in the ground. Now, obviously, if I'm buying one for a container or something like that, it's going to change a little bit, but I think, it's important to understand that if ground planting is your long-term goal, the sooner you get it in the ground, the better. Mm-hmm. The tree's going to be able to acclimate. It's going to be able to start putting in roots and getting that going. Now, a lot of times, like people, like you talked about, people get these 1 gallons and then they're going to hold them and wait until, and it's like, man, you're taking a 1 gallon that's been in a greenhouse on a watering cycle. You know what I'm saying?
And hiding it somewhere you don't look at.
Right. Yeah. That's a dangerous game you're playing sometimes. So, especially on a small 1 gallon like that, where the root system is small, you're going to really need to keep up with the watering on that. And depending on what time of the year you're planting, it's going to just dictate, how much care it needs to. So if you're planting in summer, you can do it, but you're going to need to watch that watering. You're going to need to really kind of give it extra attention. If you're planting in the fall, you're not going to have as much attention you're going to need to give it. So it just kind of depends on how much you want to get into it, how much time you have to invest into taking care of it, of what time of the year to plant.
I think there's certainly way more durable plants than a lot of people expect to. Like there's a lot going on there. I said sometimes when you plant them in the late part of the summer, they'll start to drop a little leaf or get a little crispier because the ground can dry them out. but a lot of times it's not going to affect the plant at all. I mean, one of the reasons fall's so easy is because they're about to drop leaf anyway. So if the ground makes them dry out and transpire, yeah, they're going into fall color maybe a little early, but it's not affecting the overall cycle of the plant. You want them to go through that natural cycle of releafing, dormancy. Maples like that cycle, so that's another reason why you don't grow them indoors. They don't get the cycle completely. There's no zone indoors for people. So be conscious of that as well. The quicker you get your tree in the ground, though, I think it's a fake old. They say it's an old Japanese maple proverb, but it's like, when's the best time to plant a maple? It's like 20 years ago or today. And that's true. So when you have your tree, it's going to require less attention if you go ahead and get it in the ground in general. And that's going to be your easiest bet. You can also plant the container. You know, if you know you're going to move them around, you can always, in a colder zone, you can put your pot in the ground and then move that later. Just be conscious to actually go back and get it. Don't leave it in that pot for forever. But you certainly can plant your pot in the ground. And that's more forgiving than just pots somewhere stored in a shed a lot of times too.
All right, guys, moving along here, we're going to talk about costs. Why some cultivars cost so much compared to others.
Man, some kill me. I see some markups the other day. I saw a Macawa. That was like, woo, man, I need to be selling some of these big ones we get. Sometimes there's a pretty pricey, heavy price tag on certain trees. You know, rarity can affect the tree. Age of the tree can affect the tree. We have a whole video on what's my Japanese maple worth. And certainly the bigger trees used to be a little bit heavier market. Like this guy yesterday at T-Ball was telling me, he's like, what do you do? I was like, I grow Japanese maples. He's like, my grandma has one in her garden. I bet it's worth $50,000.
That's right.
No. Probably not. I got a few buckholds that are probably bigger than that one. It's probably so you gotta have realistic expectations too. You got to get into it for the love of growing plants. It's not necessarily a get rich quick plan here, right? I mean, some of these are going to take a long time to get big, but be conscious of that. I mean, some cultivars are going to cost more. It's going to be harder for somebody starting out. You know, I see a lot of new collectors. They go straight to that snow kitten, that bloody talons, and they haven't grown a Tamukiyama or a blood good, and they're kind of like a little sticker shock on those. Certainly, some plants are going to be much slower growing. They're going to be more collectible. They're going to be rare. They're going to be, harder to obtain signwood on because they grow really slow. And so those plants tend to be a little bit more premium in cost than trees that have been out there since the 1700s. So there's certainly, a scarcity aspect of it as well. There's always new and interesting cultivars coming out. Find the right fit for you. Find the right fit for you. I find a lot of people will be very happy with a Makawi Etsubusa and a Shishigashira, which you can obtain at a really reasonable price. Those go on sale. And that might be a good tree for them to start out with and find out what they like about that tree before diving into a snow kitten. Because there's certainly different aspects of different trees, and some of them can be quite pricey. I mean, not just us, all around the Japanese maple world, the rare trees definitely going to cost more in plant collecting. But yeah, kind of something to factor in there. A lot of great plants, though, are tried and true and tested and pretty affordable for the market. I don't think we've raised our prices on our 1 gallons since I actually went down on our price of our 1 gallons since my dad owned it. I took this over from dad in 08. And so I think our 1 gallons have stayed pretty close to the same market value since then. But yeah, factor that into your garden and factor it into your consideration for the plant. So I think Japanese maples are a great plant to invest into for your landscape. You're going to get a lot of high reward out of them. They typically tend to be some of our more showy plants that we care about more in our landscape. And so it's not bad to invest a little bit more into that. Do some research. If you're buying a $4,000 planter, you might want to look around a little bit. I mean, there might be some alternatives to that. Starting small isn't a bad problem either, like you said. Like sometimes going ahead and buying that 1 gallon Makawa and getting in the ground for a few years is going to shock you when that tree's 5. It's really going to shock you at how great that tree looks in a 3 to 4 year span even. So don't be afraid to start with smaller plants. But yeah, factor that into your cost. If you need a really high impact plant, maybe that's the one you kind of splurge on a little bit more. You get like a 7 or a 10 gallon or something on that one if you're wanting to really have this one spot that's already a little bit more established. But I would recommend not to be afraid to start small if you want to kind of cut costs and collect more maples. I mean, I know your garden, just since moving from Oklahoma, has changed so much.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's fun to get into collecting, and I realize there's this cost involved with it. I think we all kind of struggle with the balance of that, of how much you're willing to invest into it and how much it's worth to you. And I think that's really where the worth comes. People always say, "Oh, how much is this worth?" And it's like, well, how much is it worth to you?
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, I've paid a price for trees that other people would probably consider way too much, but for me, it was worth it. And now I have it in my collection, and I get to go home and enjoy it every day. So the worth there is really depending on how much that tree means to you and how much you want it in your collection. And then obviously financially, I think we all, are in different places in our lives of what we can afford and all of that. But I think the market kind of drives it a little bit. I've noticed more of that kind of market influence over the last few years. As a collector, I've seen the prices kind of fluctuating on that because there's such a demand. And honestly, even though it's hard for a collector because you're paying more money, it's actually a good thing because that means there's more people that are getting into trees. There's more people that are getting into maples. So it's harder to have enough for everybody.
Right.
You know what I mean?
The perfect example is Red Panda. That one got so hyped up when it came out. Certainly was a little bit more premium price, which helped pay for a patent cost and all the R&D that goes into kind of getting those cool things. It does slowly, as the numbers increase, kind of come down in price over time. So it might take a year or two to kind of pay down some of the initial development on things, but also you're supporting an industry too. So like I always recommend people to buy the cool plants they want, whether it's maples or whatever. It takes cool plants to keep farms open. So we really appreciate it. So pretty cool stuff there, but there's a plant for everybody. So don't feel like you have to start out at a Bloody Talons, all right? It might be a very expensive 1 gallon. I mean, oftentimes those could be well over $100, maybe even $150 for a 1 gallon Bloody Talons. The original one since the 90s is about 2 feet tall, about 2 feet wide. So it's a very slow grower. There's not a lot of soundwood. So there's a high demand for collectors for things like that, but a very small amount to create. And so factor that into your consideration. If you're new to collecting, there's a lot of great plants. I mean, we put 40 new plants just on the 10 at 10s each week. There's a lot of great plants that are easy to grow that might fit what you're looking for a little bit more than going after the shiniest new thing. There's some great plants though. I mean, one of the reasons we develop plants is like that hot blonde. Now that one goes on sale all the time. That used to be a Red Panda, right? I mean, it was like, when are you ever going to have hot blonde available? Yeah. And it takes a couple years to kind of get that stock in. But I mean, there's times where we've sold hot blonde on sale, pretty significant discounts.
Right. Yeah. What do we got next, Matt?
All right, guys, pH. Look at your pH of your soil. It's good to know what they are. Japanese maples like to be slightly acidic. So really alkaline soils can be a little harder. They are super adaptive. Now, they're super adaptive to soils. If you're growing pine trees in your area, you have slightly acidic, well-drained soil. That's generally a good sign if you have a lot of native pines. You want to be careful on heavy alkaline soils. Most times you don't want to do things to adjust your pH too much. I find that people will lime and do different things to adjust their pH on maples, and it tends to throw that balance off more. Yep. But it is good to know your pH of your garden. So I definitely recommend checking your pH of your garden. Somewhere around a 6 is typically perfect for maples. Most places that are growing Japanese maples don't need to do too much pH adjustment, but it's good to know where you're at and to know your limitations. Yeah. Like certainly if you're growing them in New Mexico, your pH could be certainly a lot higher than it is here.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, especially if you're creating a landscape, you're putting things in the ground, you want your plants to kind of adapt to your natural area. I mean, you're not going to be able to mend your entire garden. You know what I mean? Like it's going to be something. So most of your plants are going to have to kind of adjust and acclimate to your soil condition. I mean, in extreme situations, there's always that, okay, maybe I need to do some amending here, but I don't really recommend a lot of amendment because you're kind of disturbing the natural soil makeup of your area. Now, obviously, like I said, there are certain situations where you may need to do some amending here. You may need to rise, if you have a really poor draining soil, something like that, raising that up and adding some amendment there can help, certainly. But I don't think it's necessarily something that should just be on your mind all the time. Like, what is the acidic level of my soil? Like most of us have whatever generic land of our property that we're planning on. And, we're not going to be able to really dictate what that soil pH is anyway, but we can have some influence.
It's good to be conscious of it, and slower modifications are better than radical changes. Yeah. So you don't want to go to try to change it overnight. Joe Gardner, I went back to him. We were on Growing a Greener World many years ago, and I hope to get him on our podcast again soon. We've scheduled him a couple times, and things came up between us having babies and his schedule. We hope to have him on our podcast at some point. He talks a lot about gardening myths on his podcast, and really putting down a good basis of that mulch we were talking about. especially pine bark mulch.
Right.
He recommends if you're starting with a fresh garden to go ahead and put down 2 to 3 inches of pine bark mulch and let that start to
Kinda
acclimate
break
your
down.
soil.
Yeah.
And you're going to really get an amenity. Tony Avent go into that podcast. He goes great into amenities for your soil too, to kind of create those ideal conditions. But you want to do those things over time. You don't want to try to change everything all at once. Those big extreme changes tend to stress out our plants. Getting down a good base of mulch really will change the composition of your soil a ton. It'll actually break down that soil and make it way more nutrient rich, and it'll help that pH a ton, especially most of our barks here on the East Coast are pine barks. Look into the different bark pHs you're putting in, but a good base of mulch as a start to your garden, especially if you're kind of starting fresh in an area, can change that and really affect that for you without having to make a lot of quick changes. Quick changes are the harder ones.
All right, guys. So we made it all the way to number 20. And I like number 20 here. It's one of the hardest things, but it's one of the most important things, right, to know and think about before buying a Japanese maple. We're talking about patience, right? Having patience to allow these trees to acclimate and grow and kind of set the expectation where our expectation grows with the plant. We don't have this like super high expectation and then it's going to take all these years before it gets to that point. I always hear that comments like, man, your garden's going to look great in 10 years. And it's like, well, I thought it looked pretty good right now. It looks great right now, so like try not to get too far ahead of yourself. And we all have these big grand plans, and I do. Every day when I go home, I look at my garden and I think about, these big grand scheme ideas that I have, and slowly but surely, with some patience and some, putting my effort into it, it's starting to come together.
Take a lot of pictures of your plants too, because they'll surprise you.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people be like, I've had this thing and it never grew. It's like, well, go back and look at a picture of it last year. It's like, well, it grew a lot.
Yeah.
And they might not really realize how much gains they're getting there. But it's interesting. My dad said never pray for patience because the Lord will bring it, right? You'll get a lesson that teaches you patience. Well, plants certainly teach us patience.
Yeah.
I get a long lesson every winter when I'm bored as heck looking at my garden because it's very maple centric. So I get that patience and anticipation of spring.
Right.
And I enjoy them out of leaf, but I really enjoy that conifer people, they get it all at once. They don't have to learn any patience.
Right.
I love conifers too. I got a lot of conifers garden, but maples certainly teach us some of these lessons. Now, don't be afraid to start with a smaller plant like Brian said, because even in that 3 to 4 year span, a lot of times those trees are going to outperform in the ground than they did in the landscape. Buy what you want, plant it, enjoy it, and don't be afraid to enjoy it at every stage. I think that's something people miss. Like I used to do tons of garden shows. We used to do 30 garden shows a year. And the number one thing I would get from people that are older in life would be like, I'll be dead and gone before that thing is the big, at maturity.
Right.
Well, I will be too. Yeah. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. I got a 3-year-old. If he plants a Nakakomoto weeping, he ain't going to see it be 400 years old, right? I don't think any of us are living as long as Noah. So you got to figure this out. But you got to enjoy your plants at every stage. So it's a journey, and enjoy those plants at each step of the stage. I enjoy 3 to 5 year gardens more than I do 50-year gardens of maples.
Yeah.
I've been to gardens in the UK. I've been to gardens. Tim went and traveled Dick Wolf's old garden, and a lot of that's 70-plus-year-old trees. And you're going, hey, I think that one's this. And people kind of put that in their mind as the grandeur of everything. And you're going to enjoy your trees in that 5-year garden.
Right.
I mean, I think it's not only gardening for that. But it's funny, people come to my parents' garden all the time, and it's getting pretty mature now. I actually planted most of the trees in Mom and Dad's garden, me and Tim, so they're not that old. I mean, I'm in my 40s. A lot of those trees have been in the ground 15, 20 years.
Right.
A lot of them. Now, there were certainly some Dad planted before us, but most of those trees were planted in that 15 to 20-year range. It's funny, people come to our garden all the time, and they go, I remember it being bigger. It's like, because all the trees were smaller.
Right, yeah.
And in some ways, the garden was more grandeur at that 5-year stage, but you have to kind of learn to appreciate it. Learn where to put your plants for the long-term spacing so you can enjoy that garden in the long-term goal. But don't get caught up in that the tree has to be 60 years old to enjoy it because, it's just not realistic for most of us as gardeners. I'm in my 40s. I'm not planting for 60 years from now. I'll be 100 years old.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to like having patience with the plant too. I think a lot of times, we're thinking it's going to have this amazing structure. When it's a young plant, it's going to take a little time to develop that. Especially like in our landscape. So, you put a 1 gallon in the ground and it's like, well, it didn't quite give me that instant gratification that I thought it would. But you have some patience, and you really kind of talk about and look and focus on the things we were talking about today, I think you're going to have much more success with something like that 1 gallon than you probably ever thought you would. And it's going to get bigger than you thought it would in that shorter amount of time. So I think patience is a huge key when it comes to growing Japanese.
You'll be so surprised. I've planted Japanese maples that were in liners with rubber bands on them, and now they're the size like that, the big Beniotaki at Mom's. I planted that with a rubber band on it when I grafted it. It's like a new little plant. So don't be surprised. Get your plants in the ground, but you got to learn to appreciate the entire journey with gardening. It's a whole journey. You can't just look for that finish line. There's no finish line with the maples, right? It's like Nakamoto Weepin's 400 years old. There's no finish line. You enjoy them at each step of the phase. And if you're collecting, there's certainly a lot of fun, and especially those new plantings, those new gardens, and appreciating them at each stage. So they're going to fill out and look amazing. But don't be in such a rush to get there. I mean, it's like my kids. I've got a 3, 6, and an 8-year-old. I'm already looking at that 8-year-old like, man, I got 10 more years with her in my house. Like, you think the kid's a kid and you're like, wow, 10 more years. Wow. But you got to enjoy, it's just like that with your plants. You got to enjoy each step of it. You got to take time each day to go, what am I enjoying about my kryptonite in this season? What am I enjoying about this 1 gallon kryptonite at this size? And don't take for granted that you're going to enjoy that growth over the years.
Yeah. Man, we appreciate you guys hanging out with us today, man. I think this was the perfect podcast to get in here and just talk about some expectations, some guidelines. We want you guys to be successful. I mean, one of my favorite things about being in the horticulture world here in the nursery business is making people happy with plants. I love whenever we have our open houses and people come and then they're like, they find that perfect tree and they're like, man, and they just seem so happy. And I want you to be able to go home, plant it, be confident, know what you're doing, feel good about it, and enjoy that plant for the rest of your life. I mean, that's what we all hope here at the farm. That's what we work hard every day to try to do, is to provide you guys with the great plant and then all the information to grow it properly.
Oh, special shout out to Sean, our podcast producer, who came up with this topic and wrote a lot of this, answering a lot of questions he's seeing you guys give us on social media. So if you have questions about Japanese maples, we love to help you answer them here on the Mr. Maple Show, whether it's through the podcast or through the daily Japanese maple shows we put out on the Mr. Maple Show. If you have suggestions for questions, go to our Japanese maple group on Facebook. It's just Mr. Maple Friends on Facebook. Let us know your suggestions. You can also put future suggestions for ideas under this video. So if you're watching it on YouTube, give us some comments about questions you have about Japanese maples. We'd love to help you answer them. Our goal with this channel is to make it easier for you to grow Japanese maples, to give you better success, and hopefully you'll come back and shop with us some more as you find great success growing Japanese maples.
Absolutely. If you guys ever get a chance to come to one of our open houses, I always got to plug this because there's so much fun. One, you get to come and meet all of us and hang out, and we get everybody talking about plants. 2, you get to walk through the greenhouses, put your hands on some of these plants that we've been talking about today. And it's a great community to be a part of. And then, what I love about that community is like, if you have some of these questions, there's a great group of people to ask those questions. Say, hey, I'm having some trouble. What's going on with my tree? Maybe I'm not getting the right colors. Maybe I'm having some sunburn or some scorch or something, and just this community that you belong to, I think allows you to have access to a lot of information that's important.
AI is great, but real life experience trumps it every time.
That's right.
You can get it here on the Mr. Maple Show. We take accounts of people all over the world. We ship trees to people, all over the United States, and we try to factor that into our answers for you guys and give you really detailed answers that'll help you garden with them. So if you like that kind of thing, make sure to subscribe. Go give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform as well. That helps other people see it. And we really would appreciate it if you'd share our podcasts and videos with your gardening friends. So if you're in a gardening club, let them know about this. Maybe it'll be something that helps their garden along. We really appreciate you tuning in today.
Take care.
God bless.
Have a great day.